Okay, greetings. This is going to be my opening lecture for critical thinking. And it's, what is critical thinking anyway? And let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, here we are. So what is critical thinking anyway? Or how come that didn't work? Why isn't this working? 3 things you can do with a claim. So when presented with a claim, one can accept it as true, one can reject it as false, or one can suspend judgment about it, right? So for any claim, you can adopt one of 3 noetic stances towards it. Again, accept it as true, reject it as false, or suspend belief. I can't tell whether this claim being presented is true or false. Now, actually, one might maintain that what is being presented as a claim, in fact, is not a claim at all. And therefore, you can't do any of those 3 things, right? Why? Well, because it isn't actually a claim. We'll have more to say about that later on in this presentation and also in this course. But on the assumption that you're actually being presented with a claim, those are the 3 possibilities. Critical thinking is about determining whether or not one has been given sufficient reason to take one of these 3 actions. Again, believe, disbelieve, or suspend belief. Is there good reason to accept, reject, or to abstain from judgment, a kind of agnosticism? Which is of these reactions would be most in line with the facts and evidence. To do this, we have to ask, what is the proper basis upon which we should decide to accept, reject, or withhold judgment? Often, the proper basis takes the form of an argument. That is, certain claims, premises, which are offered in support of the disputed claim, the purported conclusion. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking at argument and argument analysis in this course. Just as I said, we'll be spending a good deal of time looking at arguments. For the purposes of this class, I am defining an argument as verbal attempts to persuade. Right? So, of course, you could have a shouting match where you go, shut up, no, you shut up. And in certain cases, that might be considered an argument, but that's not the sort of argument we're going to be looking at. So we might refer to those kinds of shouting matches as an argument outside of this course. But within this course, we're understanding arguments as verbal attempts to persuade. Arguments consist of 2 parts, conclusions and premises, right? That's more or less the anatomy of an argument. The conclusion is the thesis that I want you to accept, that I want you to believe, and the premises are the reasons I provide to persuade you to accept my thesis, to accept my conclusion. Critical thinking will involve examining the quality of the premises and their connection to the conclusion. Are the premises of such a quality that they are persuasive, or can they be persuasive? Are the premises connected to the conclusion in the right way so that they make them jointly persuasive of the conclusion? Again, we'll be spending the remainder of the course at looking at those kinds of questions. There is a fundamental aspect to critical thinking, which is perhaps more fundamental than examining the elements of an argument. We have to understand what the context of the argument is, or what is at issue. So that is actually stuff that needs to get established and up front, and must always remain first and foremost when examining arguments. What is the issue that the argument is attempting to address? For instance, if I'm providing you with an argument to convince you that the death penalty is an inefficient deterrent for capital crime, then the argument arises from the contention at issue, right? We can express the issue in terms of a question. Is the death penalty an inefficient deterrent to capital crime? I'm saying the answer to that question is yes. One who would disagree with me would say no, or one might say, I don't have enough evidence to tell whether that the answer to that question is yes or no, right? But that is what is at issue in my argument. It's always a good idea when evaluating an argument to step back a moment and ask, what is the issue? Sometimes you'll find that two individuals engaged in argumentation might not, in fact, be dealing with the same issue, or are misunderstanding or mischaracterizing the issue of their opponents. So that can waste a lot of time when they're really just talking past one another because one person is dealing with one issue and somebody else is dealing with a different issue. For instance, were I to make my case that the death penalty is a poor deterrent to capital crime, and my interlocutor responded that the death penalty was warranted for certain very heinous crimes as just retribution, my interlocutor has switched to a different issue. Specifically, they are arguing the issue, is the death penalty warranted for certain very heinous crimes as just retribution? Now, this is certainly a worthwhile question, but it's a different question. It's a different issue than the one I began with, my initial one. And it's missing the point of my argument because now it's moved on to another issue. So this is a helpful way of dealing with any arguments you're confronted with. Step back and ask, what is the issue? And then put it in the form of a question. After that, determine whether or not the individuals engaged in the argument are in fact operating with the same issue. Are they talking to one another, or are they talking past one another? Again, this can save a lot of time. There was a fair amount of years when I worked in the administration here at FIU, and I have to tell you that more than once I would be in meetings where I discovered that individuals were talking about two different issues and didn't seem quite aware of that. In an academic setting, I recall attending a debate a number of years ago, and the general topic was pornography and the propriety of pornography. One of the disputing parties was taking the position that pornography, when enjoyed by adults and when not the product of a violation of rights of others, was perfectly morally permissible and in fact was morally neutral. I seem to recall he was saying that it was not unlike playing a game of tennis. So long as no one's getting hurt and no one's rights are being violated, it fails to be a moral issue at all. His opponent took the position that pornography was immoral because it does indeed violate the rights of women. Now, I'm not interested in evaluating their respective arguments at this time. I'm bringing up this example because this is one more example where we're really dealing with two different issues. They're not dealing with the same issues. One party had already conceded that, should pornography in fact violate rights, it would be morally reprehensible. So in that sense, he's agreeing with his opponent on that point. However, he didn't in fact think that all pornography violated rights in the way that his opponent did. His issue was, if pornography harms no one and violates no one's rights, does it fail to be a moral issue at all? And he thinks the answer to that question is yes. So that was the issue he was presenting. Right? Her issue is pornography immoral because it violates the rights of women? Again, a worthwhile question, but not the question he was asking and not the argument he was addressing. So there are two issues at play. Is pornography morally permissible per se? And does pornography result in the violation of the rights of women? Note further that the issue, is pornography morally permissible when it results in the violation of rights, is not an issue here at all, since both parties agree that it is not. So that issue doesn't arise because both of them would agree the answer to that question is it is not morally permissible when it's a violation of rights. But that's my point. Be clear what the issue is and what the question is, and stay focused to make sure all parties are staying focused on the same issue. But there's another reason for getting the issue straight right from the beginning, because it's a way of catching troublesome vagueness or ambiguity early on. Note that when the issue is clearly stated, we sometimes expose potentially troublesome words and phrases in terms of vagueness and ambiguity. If the issue were stated, should the wealthy pay their fair share? Well, this is a horribly flawed statement of an issue. Do you see why that would be, it would be foolhardy to start arguing that the answer to that question is yes or the answer to that question is no at this point. Hopefully you saw that it has at least two words that are very vague. What exactly does one mean by wealthy? And what exactly does one mean by fair share? Any argument offered to the affirmative or the negative on that question would have to clarify these troublesome terms. So it's better to do this in the statement of the issue right up front when possible, and it reduces the danger of people arguing different issues. For instance, if my idea of wealthy is importantly different than your idea of wealthy, then we aren't dealing with the same issue, right? If I think wealthy is anybody who makes more than $1 million a year, and you think wealthy is anybody who makes more than $500,000 a year, whichever one of us might be right or wrong, or what stance we take, we simply are talking about two different classes of individuals. We'll be looking at an argument in support of vegetarianism in a bit. However, it's worth pointing out, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, that in fact, the issue being dealt with in that particular argument is not whether vegetarianism is morally required. I suspect that were the proponent of the argument successful in pushing her conclusion, she might use that conclusion to go on further and argue for the moral superiority of a vegetarian lifestyle. But strictly speaking, that's not the issue of that particular argument, and we'll see that in a little bit. So again, just as it's important to be clear on what one is arguing for, what the issue is, it's also important to be clear about what is not being argued for and what has not been established. I like to point out an example that comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. After Thomas Aquinas famously argues for an unmoved mover, because of a rather succinct argument that the reality must have an unmoved mover, he goes on at the end of that argument to say, and that all men call God. Now, Aquinas has been accused of playing fast and loose with the logic here. After all, it's one thing to prove the existence of an unmoved mover, but to identify that thing, whatever that thing is, with God, would take another argument, perhaps several. The argument itself does not prove the existence of God. God isn't actually even mentioned in the article. The word God doesn't appear until the very end, where Aquinas throws it in at the end and says, and that all men call God. Prior to that, he's talking about moved movers and unmoved movers. Now, in Aquinas's defense, he does provide those arguments elsewhere. Actually, he, in thousands and thousands of pages of writing, he provides rather detailed arguments linking these things together. But also, when he makes the claim in Summa Theologica at the end of that argument, he may simply have been stating a matter of historical fact. It so happens that everyone who had considered and affirmed the unmoved mover argument subsequently went on to identify the unmoved mover with God. Hence, it's a historical fact that that thing all men have called God, right? And that might have been simply what he was saying there. Nevertheless, while the criticism of Aquinas in this case may be misplaced, the general admonition remains. Be attentive to what is at issue and what has not been argued for, right? Where, if successful, where does the argument take us? And not assume that it takes us further than the actual conclusion warrants. Claims, beliefs, propositions, sentences, and statements, they're all the same thing. My philosophy of language teacher would have a heart attack if he had heard me say something like that. But in common parlance, we do not always make sharp distinctions between these items. I might say your statement is correct, or your sentence is true, or your proposition is accurate. And by statement, sentence, proposition, I'm pretty much referring to the same thing, or at least I don't have clearly distinct things in mind under normal circumstances, again, in normal conversation. In philosophy of language, however, these things often are distinguished one from another. A belief seems to be a mental item. Sentences are physical things like words printed on a page, or phonemes uttered within a system of language. Statements, too, seem to be linguistic acts. Propositions are often referred to as that which is expressed through sentences. And in fact, the same proposition might be expressed through varying sentences. Were I to say snow is white, and then 2 seconds later say snow is white again, I've expressed one proposition with 2 different sentences. Or were I to say Schnee ist weiß, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the German correctly, I've expressed the same proposition, snow is white, but with a German sentence. And notice that sentence, Schnee ist weiß, has the property of being German. The proposition doesn't. So it shows that propositions and sentences don't look like they're really the same thing. These distinctions are indeed important for certain purposes and in certain contexts. However, they need not concern us much here. I shall go forward using a more generic, less nuanced understanding of the terms, and I'm simply going to talk about claims. And I just understand the claim as the bearer of a truth value. A claim is something which is either true or false. So that's what I mean by bearer of a truth value. It's either a T or an F. And leave open the question of whether claims are propositions or sentences or statements or whatnot. And so if we come across a bit of language which is neither true nor false, then it is not a claim. It might be a pseudo claim, right? It appears to be true or false, but if you poke at it, you might even notice, wait a minute, that's not actually true or false. I'm adopting roughly the same idea as logical positivists will adopt, and which we will be examining shortly. Likewise, if I stub my toe and I say, oh, well, this is not a claim because it's neither true nor false. This is a sentence. It's a sentence in English, right? It's an interjection, but interjections are neither true nor false. Yum, boo, hooray. These are not true or false sentences. Therefore, they are not claims. Similarly, were I to say colorless green ideas sleep furiously, this is also a sentence. And here it's not an interjection. Here it's a declarative sentence with a subject and a verb and a predicate. But it's not a claim. And why is it not a claim? Well, because it's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. Right? Again, we can tell it's neither true nor false. It's not like colorless green ideas don't sleep furiously. Again, were I to ask, what time is it? This also fails to be a claim. In this case, this is an interrogative. It's a question. I'm not making some sort of pronouncement about the world, but rather I'm requesting information. So we see already now that claims usually take the form of declarative sentences, but even some declarative sentences are not, in fact, claims. Sometimes sentences which look like claims are not because they're not being used as claims. For instance, when I'm reciting the Gettysburg Address and I say, 407 years ago, our fathers, I think it should be say forefathers, I've misquoted, brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It may look like I'm making a claim. Notice Lincoln really was making a claim when he said those very same words. But in my case, I'm not making a claim. And of course, if I were, I'd be making a false one because it's been longer than 407 years ago, right? But I'm not making a claim. Why is that? Well, because the reason I'm uttering those words is not to make some claim about reality, but is to recite this famous speech. Right. So usually poetry recitations or speech recitations, even if they contain declarative sentences, are not necessarily exercises in making claims. What we're interested in then would be those speech acts which are trying to express claims, and again, which are either true or false. Now, this attempt can fail in varying ways. We've already looked at some. But one we will be looking at in some detail is when the bit of language under scrutiny is not really a claim, but is some other bit of language. Again, this raises the interesting question, how do you tell genuine claims from what I will call pseudo claims, or what later the logical positivists call pseudo assertions, right? Well, we'll be talking about that in a bit. When I first, hot sauce on scrambled eggs, subjective and objective claims. When I first started putting together notes for this lecture on the difference between objective and subjective claims, I thought it would be relatively easy. After all, I know what objective claims are and what subjective claims are and how they differ, and I simply need to explain that to you. In fact, you might already know what the difference is between objective and subjective claims, which would tend to make this part of the lecture unnecessary. But when I actually started to try and nail it down the details, I found it was a little more problematic than I anticipated. So let me begin with where I started, and I will call this the naive, if somewhat serviceable, account of the difference between objective and subjective claims. An objective claim is a claim the truth of which in no way depends on any facts about the speaker. Were I to say the earth is flat, whether or not that claim is true is completely independent of my beliefs or any other facts about me. Now, you might infer that I do in fact believe the earth is flat based on my making that statement. And you are therefore attributing to me a certain subjective state, a belief. But that's not what makes the sentence, the earth is flat, true or false. What makes that sentence true or false is no fact about me, but rather some fact, albeit an objective fact, about the earth. So we would take the sentence, the earth is flat, to be an objective claim. A false objective claim, but an objective claim. A subjective claim is a claim the truth of which does depend on some fact about the speaker. So for instance, if I said hot sauce goes good on scrambled eggs, this would be a sentence that would be true based on some feature about me. When I say hot sauce goes good on scrambled eggs, I'm more or less achieving the same linguistic work were I to say I enjoy the taste of hot sauce on scrambled eggs. But notice, I enjoy the taste of hot sauce on scrambled eggs is not an objective feature about hot sauce or about scrambled eggs. It's a subjective report. I'm sharing with you a certain preference of mine. It's describing some feature about me, the subject, and that's why it's called subjective. I'm not making a claim about the objective world, but rather sharing a subjective state. This, of course, is why these claims are referred to as subjective. The truth or falsity of these claims depend on some feature of the speaker. Now, to be clear, the grammar would suggest that I'm talking about hot sauce and scrambled eggs, right? Notice the subject of that sentence is hot sauce, and I'm making some claim about hot sauce and its connection to scrambled eggs, or at least so it would appear. The grammar would make it appear that way. So there's a temptation, because of that grammar, there's a temptation to regard it as an objective claim. But when we do, we're being misled by the grammar. The truth is the matter is that I'm really talking about myself. I'm sharing some preference of mine. In the same way, were I to say peaches are delicious, again, it may appear that I'm talking about peaches, but I'm not. I'm talking about me. Now, later we'll be looking at diagramming sentences. And notice if you were to diagram that declarative sentence, peaches are delicious, clearly the subject is peaches, the verb is are, and delicious is the predicate adjective. So you're predicating delicious of peaches, and the grammar suggests that that sentence is about peaches. But to regard it as such is to be misled by the grammar, because it's not about peaches. It's really about me, hence subjective. Hopefully you can see that the sentence peaches are delicious might plausibly be understood as the linguistic equivalent of I like the taste of peaches, or even simply peaches, right? But notice peaches isn't even a declarative sentence. That's a interjection, right? The later two, that should read, I see the typo now, the later two renderings make it clear that I'm not providing any objective information about peaches when I utter the sentence, peaches are delicious. Now, the sentence, peaches are on sale at Winn-Dixie is not a subjective claim. Either they are or they are not. And it has nothing to do with any subjective facts about me or my preferences. So this is one way of trying to distinguish objective and subjective claims. That seems to be simple and straightforward enough. However, notice the sentence, Kenton Harris likes the taste of peaches, is an objective claim about Kenton Harris. It's either true or false. Either I do or I do not like the taste of peaches. And it's not an objective claim about peaches, but it is an objective claim about Kenton Harris. So that makes things a little bit more complicated, right? Again, if I say, I like the taste of peaches, is that an objective claim? Yeah, it's an objective claim about me. It's either true or false, right? And yet it does seem to turn upon some fact about me. So that neat distinction between objective and subjective is a little more complicated. I might be tempted to say that the sentence peaches are delicious is a subjective claim because it depends on the truth, of some feature about the speaker, but that is in a way misleading. Were I to reinterpret the sentence as the speaker likes the taste of peaches, this would be an objective claim about the world. Granted, it's an objective claim about the subjective states of the speaker, but it's an objective claim nonetheless. But that messes up our neat little divide between objective and subjective claims. So let me try again. In a standard, genuinely objective claim, you are not talking about the subjective states of any speaker, but rather an objective fact or an objective state of affairs. If a sentence could plausibly be recast and achieve the same linguistic work by being a sentence about the subjective states of the speaker, then this is a subjective claim. So we'll make it a little more nuanced that way. Peaches are delicious and hot sauce is good on scrambled eggs are subjective under this revision. Here they are both literally talking about the gustatorial matters of pure taste. If the sentence cannot plausibly be rewritten such that it is a statement about the subjective states of the speaker, a sentence like the earth is flat, or there are 50 states in the United States, or Paris is the capital of France, then these would be objective claims, not subjective claims. Where the difference between subjective and objective claims becomes most interesting and perhaps most important is in the realms of moral and aesthetic judgments. Some people have suggested that aesthetic judgments are like judgments of pure taste, that is, subjective, doing nothing other than reporting the subjective preferences of the speaker. Were I to tell you I saw a magnificent painting last weekend, right? What do you know about the painting? Nothing. You know something about me. I had a good time. I liked the painting, but that doesn't give you some fact about the painting. Some people have argued that, that's what's going on in subjective judgments. You're really just issuing subjective reports. On such a view, sentences such as the Mona Lisa is the greatest painting in the world would be equivalent to the claim, I admire the Mona Lisa more than I admire any other painting in the world. Or the Miami City Ballet is a better ballet company than the San Francisco Ballet would be relegated to a mere expression of the speaker preference. Some have suggested this is what's going on in moral judgments as well. We will discuss both of those positions later on in this course, but for now we need only be clear about the distinction between subjective and objective claims. Now, in a similar way, people make a distinction sometimes between facts and opinions. Sometimes people talk about the difference between something being a fact and something being an opinion, right? So you might make the statement like recreational marijuana should be legalized, and your friend may respond to you something like, well, that's just your opinion. And when they say, well, that's just your opinion, they have in mind that's neither true nor false. You're not stating a fact. You're really just stating a subjective preference, something like that. In other words, in common conversations, the word opinion is often distinguished from a fact. This is close to the distinction we've already drawn between objective claims, true ones state facts, and subjective claims. But I don't like this use of the word opinion. For one thing, it's vague and imprecise. But further, there are lots of things which are opinions, which are either facts or not. Right? For instance, it might be my opinion that the Miami Marlins is going to win the World Series this year. Well, time will tell whether this opinion states a fact or a falsehood. So regardless, it's true or false. They either will or they won't. Now, I'm willing to grant that some things which are referred to as opinions are neither true nor false. But rather than refer to these as opinions and use that word for that purpose, I prefer to identify them as pseudo claims, like we talked before, or what the positivists regard as pseudo assertions. Again, lacking a truth value, not really true or false. Cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are unconscious psychological factors that can affect human mental processes, sometimes in unexpected ways. For instance, it has been shown that formal business attire or a physician's white lab coat might improve a person's performance on a cognitive test. So dress up when you're taking an exam because it might actually improve your performance. And you go, well, why should that have anything to do with it? Wonderful question, but I don't know. I just know that it may have something to do with improving your cognitive ability. Studies have shown this. People are perceived as being more trustworthy when wearing blue. This is why so often you'll see politicians wearing blue when they're making speeches and this sort of thing, or witnesses are sometimes encouraged to wear blue when they're testifying in court. I don't know, but studies have shown this. Maybe if you've taken a course in legal psychology, you're aware of this already. In other studies, male subjects, if dressed in sweatpants, made less profitable deals in simulated negotiations than did subjects dressed in suits. So one wonders about what's happening with COVID and everybody's on Zoom calls in their sweats. Were we entirely rational, our conclusions would be grounded in logic alone and based on evidence objectively weighed. But unconscious features of human psychology prevents this from happening, and we aren't entirely rational creatures. Cognitive biases skew our perceptions and other cognitive processes. We tend to agree with arguments when we want to believe the conclusions, even if it's not a very good argument. Consider this argument. All pit bulls are dogs. Some dogs bite, therefore some pit bulls bite. Now, this might appear to be a good argument if you don't examine it critically, but it isn't. Look at an argument with the identical form. All pit bulls are dogs. Some dogs are named Mary, therefore some pit bulls are named Mary. Yeah, but wait a minute. That doesn't really follow, does it? Now, you realize, at least I suspect you realize right away, that these premises of this second argument give you little to no reason to accept the conclusion. But you may not have seen that initially with the first argument. And why is that? Well, I suspect that the first argument has a conclusion that you already believed. So you're not really asking, does this argument give me reason to accept this conclusion, since you've already accepted it, right? And so you're being less scrupulous in your analysis. But here you probably did not already begin the day thinking that some pit bulls are named Mary. And now the issue arises, is it the case that some pit bulls are named Mary? And you're trying to decide whether the proper answer to that question is yes or no, and how to regard that conclusion, and whether these premises have given you reason to accept a conclusion you previously did not have. Again, this is probably due to the fact that the conclusion of the first argument states something you already believed, and the conclusion to the second argument does not. In the latter case, the conclusion states something you neither believe nor disbelieve. You are agnostic and are now considering whether you have been given good reason to move from agnosticism to belief. By the way, you have not. The techniques of critical thinking are meant to be a corrective to some of these cognitive biases. So two very common cognitive biases, and we'll talk about more later in the class, is belief bias, which is the tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion. Again, if you already accepted the conclusion, you're going to tend to evaluate the reasoning as good. And confirmation bias, the tendency to attach more weight to evidence that supports a viewpoint without justification. Why? Because it's something you already want to believe. Some cognitive biases are actually helpful heuristics, general rules we unconsciously follow in estimating probabilities. If we hear about a particular event occurring frequently, we might assign a high degree of probability to that type of event, like wildfires or child abductions or I don't know, other phenomena, plane crashes. While this may be helpful in some cases, technically though, it's unwarranted. The actual probability of an event occurring has little to nothing to do with how frequently I have heard about these events, right? So it might be biased reporting, right? These things are just making it into the news more. Maybe it's more popular to lead with these kinds of stories, and so I'm hearing about them more and more because they're being reported more and more, but they aren't necessarily happening any more frequently than they ever did. They may or they may not, but the fact that I'm hearing about them more does not tell me whether they in fact are happening more often. That's the idea. It does not follow that if one hears about a spectacular plane crashes more often, their probability has increased. We will be looking at these and other cognitive biases when we look at informal fallacies later on in this course. In large part, the biases explain why these fallacies are so effective in persuading people despite providing no rational grounds for persuasion. Rational choice. Critical thinking is aimed at coming to correct conclusions and making wise choices or decisions. We know from everyday experience that desires, fears, personal objectives, and various emotions affect choices. Experimental psychologists have discovered other and more unexpected and surprising influences on our thinking. I found this one to be particularly interesting. In a recent experiment, researchers at Yale and Harvard universities asked subjects to evaluate job candidates by reading the applicant's resume, which had been attached to a clipboard. Some of the clipboards weighed 3/4 of a pound, and others weighed 4/4 of a pound. Subjects holding the heavier clipboards rated the applicant as better overall, despite the fact that the resumes were identical, right? So there was no qualitative difference in the resumes. The only qualitative difference was one clipboard was heavier than the other. Evidently, a rational evaluation of a person's qualification may be affected by irrelevant physical considerations. You may also be aware of something called the beauty bias, right? Where attractive people are perceived as more intelligent, as more honest, as harder working, as better leaders, for no other reason than that they happen to be attractive by popular standards, right? Again, it's a well-documented feature called the beauty bias. It can be worked against, but you have to know it's there. And you have to go, oh, this is a very attractive individual. I have to be careful I'm not overestimating his abilities or her abilities, right? Because there is that tendency. Or perhaps this is not such an attractive individual. I must be careful I'm not underestimating this individual's abilities due to these irrelevant considerations. The best defense of not falling prey to these biases, making it a habit to think critically and to be especially critical of arguments and evidence that seem to accord with what we already believe. And of course, this is very challenging, particularly when our social media news feeds tend to give us the stories that tend to agree with what we've already said we are interested in or we like, or positions we've staked out and agreed with and liked in the past. So it's feeding into this cognitive bias. Rhetoric. When speaking to an audience, the first rule of rhetoric is know your audience, right? I had a colleague when I was in administration. She was a faculty member in the English department, but we were doing administrative stuff together. And she would always point out to me, Kenton, the first rule of rhetoric, know your audience. Meaning, know what it is that, where they are, what they believe, how they understand. Because remember, in order for me to persuade you, I have to provide you with premises that you already accept. So I have to know what you already believe. And then I have to build from where you are to where I want you to come, right, to my conclusion, to my thesis. I can't start with premises you don't accept. Those would be very ineffective arguments. So again, I have to know my audience. One might include logical syllogisms to persuade one's audience. Let's hope one does. However, it's important to know how the premises of the argument will be understood and received. Often, complex social forces make drawing clear conclusions, even from reliable premises, difficult. In fact, in some cases, it may be that syllogistic reasoning may undercut a point you are making, and not for logical reasons, but rather for rhetorical reasons. Um, when I would attempt to do logical reasoning with my wife, that didn't often go very well. Not because she wasn't a logical woman, she very much was, but it's how that was received, right? Particularly if it was a dispute of some kind, right? Sometimes it'd be perceived as patronizing or demeaning. Right? For example, when dealing with the behaviors of close friends or family members, the seeming sterility of a syllogistic argument may in fact put off the person one is addressing. So again, that doesn't mean the argument was poorly formed. It meant that the rhetorical packaging of the argument was badly done, right? So you have to look at these other things when trying to persuade. Syllogisms are a critical part of the process of persuasion for philosophers like Aristotle, etc. And he points that out, that arguers need to use these to enhance their effectiveness in arguments. However, in addition to logic, speakers also need to incorporate what Aristotle terms the canons of rhetoric. And from classical times onward, Aristotle's guidelines for making an effective argument more compelling have been advocated by teachers of rhetoric. Famously, the orator Senator Cicero in the ancient Rome develops these 5 canons of rhetoric, which he is getting from Aristotle: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. I won't go through them here, but they're in the notes. Oh, I guess I will go through them here, but I'm going to go through them briefly. Invention, the process of coming up with the material for the text. So you're inventing the text that you're going to be presenting, right? Either spoken or written. And then the arrangement, deciding how to order the material of the text so that it will be received well, that it makes a logical, coherent presentation, that it can be understood in a clear and unambiguous way. But this is still the pre-writing stage, or kind of just outlining. Style, the process of coming up with the actual words in the text to be used. And this canon is, you're first now approaching the drafting stage. And what is the tone? What is the approach? Again, the style of it. Aristotle recommended that for speaking, you want to commit this to memory. But even if it's a written thing, that you're reading a speech, maybe at a professional conference or something like that, nevertheless, you still probably want to commit large portions of it to memory so that you can give it in an unambiguous way. You're less likely to make mistakes, etc. And then delivery, the process of presenting the text or the spoken word to the audience. Like memory, delivery is less prominent in writing than in oratory. However, there are many occasions when writers must think how best to deliver their text, right? You may want to include a joke or a pause for dramatic effect, etc. Social media and cognitive bias. I'm simply going to be telling you that you maybe already have watched the Netflix docudrama, The Social Dilemma. Maybe you plan on doing that. I'm not going to require that you do that. It is Netflix and you'd be charged if you don't have Netflix already. And I don't think I can provide it to you. But I do recommend that you do it. And I am going to require you to listen to a podcast by Kim Commando. Kim Commando is a radio talk show host who hosts a weekly program on media and technology and this sort of thing. And she also has podcasts, and she's been doing this for many years. And she has an interview with the director of The Social Dilemma, with Jeff Orlowski, there we go. And they discuss the docudrama, his work, they discuss it, and some of the implications that come out of that. And so I want you to be aware of again, how social media feeds into our cognitive biases as a way of better understanding what to be careful of and warn. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So I will stop sharing. Hope you found this walk through the lecture notes hopeful. And naturally, if you have any questions, by all means, you're encouraged to contact me by email. And we can always set up a Zoom meeting if you want to discuss some of this in person. Until next time, signing off.